Welcome to the 245th episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Rutherford. Stay tuned for my interview with Jonathan Drori, author of the nonfiction book Around the World in 80 Trees. Stay tuned for the interview. Well, welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is Jonathan Drori, author of the book Around the World in 80 Trees. Jonathan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Great. Well, if someone listening hasn't heard about your book Around the World in 80 Trees yet, can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially a group of 80 short biographies, plant portraits, if you like, of my favorite trees. Not individual trees, but species around the world. And what I've tried to do is to combine a bit of history, a bit of science, a bit of culture, because I think the most interesting things happen at the boundaries between subjects, and that's what I've tried to get across in the stories.
And what interested you about trees and led you to writing this book?
Well, I grew up near the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. You can probably tell from my accent that I'm British. And I grew up in London. And my father had really always been interested in botany from a scientific point of view. And my mother had been interested in plants from the kind of the beauty and gardening point of view. And they dragged me and my brother off to Kew Gardens practically every weekend for my whole childhood. And I think something probably sunk in. One of the things that my parents used to do was feed us bits of the plants, to keep us interested and then tell us stories about them. And I remember having a lick of an opium poppy, which was had a great reaction, actually. It's less the reaction of the slight numbness on my tongue, but the reaction of my teacher when I told her. That was interesting, yeah.
Well, following your research, do you have a favorite tree from around the world?
Well, it's like asking which is your favourite child, isn't it? At least the other trees that I exclude won't be hurt by it. But there are several. There's one which is the cedar of Lebanon, one of the reasons that I love that one so much is that I remember when I was little. Seeing the cedar in a park near us, and my dad telling us amazing stories about the history of the cedar and how the Phoenicians had used the wood for building ships and had this fantastic navy as a result, and amazing stories. And once we found it had been struck by lightning and the tree had died, and I remember it was the first time I saw my dad cry. It's very sort of moving, even just thinking about it now. And he, I think as a sort of 6 or 7 year old, I'd always thought that my father was in benign control of everything. And it was a sort of realization that actually he wasn't. And, it's a sort of part of, a rite of passage in a way. But the cedar of Lebanon has always been a great favorite since. And then another one that I absolutely love is the what's called the Quiver Tree. It's a relative of the aloe, like the aloe vera that you use in cosmetics. And it's a sort of 40-foot high tree that grows in the desert in Namibia. And, that part of southern Africa is incredibly dry. And this thing is, it just flourishes there and it's fantastically resilient. But the reason I love it is because it's the national tree of Namibia, and so when anyone sees it, they smile. It's like driving a Morris Minor. I don't know if you know that car, but when you drive one of those, everyone smiles at you. And the thought of being a tree that everyone smiles at, it's also got this sort of wonderful finish that on the bark that's a sort of waxy, white, powdery coating that makes you want to touch it. So the thought of being a tree that people smile at and want to stroke is a sort of wonderful thing.
And given the numerous headlines and news stories about climate change and obviously scientific studies, what will the immediate impact of climate change be on the trees that most people know?
Well, there's two kinds of impact. There's the first and the sort of most obvious one, which people can immediately relate to, is the trees aren't getting enough water, so they die. The climate becomes drier in a place, or it becomes wetter, or it becomes hotter, and the trees haven't adapted to that, and so they suffer. A second thing that happens is that when trees are suffering, they're more likely to get diseases and pests and so on that they can't fend off, because trees can't up sticks and run away. They need to defend themselves. And they have all sorts of ways of doing that. But if the climate changes too rapidly, they can't adapt. Then another way that which is more subtle but actually more dangerous for trees, is that trees depend on a whole lot of other organisms in order to survive. So, the flowering trees, for example, they depend on insects or bats or all sorts of things to come and take their pollen from place to place. And that's how they make baby trees, right? And if those pollinators aren't around when the flowers are out, then the tree can't have babies. And what happens with climate change is that all those sort of little relationships get thrown out of kilter. They, when the flowers are out, suddenly the insects aren't there at the right time, or when the seeds are ready, there's the little critters and animals that will disperse those seeds just aren't sort of available in the right quantities, and so the trees have difficulty making the next generation. And so actually there are quite a lot of trees that are under stress one way or another. And
So Around the World in 80 Trees is an illustrated book. Can you tell us about the illustrator and their work on your book?
Yeah, the illustrations are by a French artist living in London called Lucille Clerc, who is just fantastic. I mean, she's done a lot of botanical illustration before, but the approach she comes at is sort of quite surreal. And that combined with the design and production value of the book, which I can't claim credit for, but the publisher, Lawrence King, has really sort of pushed the boat out. So it's not a coffee table book. It's really designed as something where the pictures and words complement each other, and you want to engage with both. But the sort of combination of that design, the quality of the paper, that sort of heaviness of it, with these sort of remarkable illustrations, I think creates something that's really very beautiful, and the publisher should be proud. I wish I could take credit for all of it, but I can only take credit for the words.
Great. Well, in your research for your book, were there any facts or discoveries about trees that particularly surprised you?
Again and again, I was surprised. I suppose the trees have evolved, to their own pace, doing their own thing. But some of the things that they've evolved to do have had remarkable effects on human beings. So, for example, there's a poisonous sap in the lacquer tree, the Japanese lacquer tree, that has been used for thousands of years for painting layer on layer of this very plastic-like material. If you can imagine what that would have been like 1,000 years ago before plastics were invented, how people would have felt about these sort of waterproof materials that had come from the sap of the lacquer tree. But these Japanese monks, a particular sect of monks, started experimenting with that lacquer and kind of mummifying themselves while they were still alive. They used to drink this solution of this lacquer, of this sap, and become kind of plasticized. And they had this very slow death. And when they died, they were so poisonous. Their bodies were so poisonous, but that when they were buried, they wouldn't decompose. And if they were dug up after a certain length of time and no maggots were infesting them, that was a sort of way to instant Buddhahood, which is just a sort of extraordinary story. That was only made illegal in Japan in the late 19th century. And you can still go to Japanese shrines and see these mummies. They put dark glasses on them for some reason. And then there was a tree from Indonesia that has a kind of latex, which the tree has evolved in order to engulf any insects and seal any wounds that there might be. But the latex itself absolutely changed the world. This was a substance that at the end of the 19th century people discovered was the best possible and only possible insulator for submarine cables. Now, that doesn't sound very interesting, but it meant that suddenly nations could talk to each other on the telephone. And that wasn't possible before people used gutta percha. The only use of it nowadays is in dental implants. And again there are these examples of things that trees have done. that have had this sort of profound impact on human society. One of my favourites is a tree that in Britain is called Leylandii, and it's the product of two trees that should never have had sex, but they did, in a garden in Wales in the 19th century. The two trees were from opposite ends of California. They were planted in a garden in Wales. They hybridized and created an absolutely monster child, which we know in England as Leylandii. And what's interesting is not so much the botanical story, though that is interesting, but the way that the British have kind of weaponized the tree. The British are completely hung up about privacy and marking territory, and they tend to have small gardens, small yards, and when the neighbours are too close, they plant this tree as a kind of living hedge. And up until the turn of this century, there weren't regulations about the height of trees, only about the height of fences. And so people were literally murdering each other over the loss of light and the inability to sort of see out because the neighbours had planted this kind of green wall. And at one point there were 18,000 simultaneous court cases going on, all to do with that tree. It's fantastic.
Wow. Well, I know that there have been, in the last couple of years, some popular science articles about trees communicating with each other. I'm curious if you have done any, in your research, if you had looked at any of that and what your thoughts were on it.
Oh, yeah. I was on the board of the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew for 9 years, and there was a lot of work going on about what are called mycorrhizae. This is a fantastic word for Scrabble. It's basically the networks of fungi that some people have called the Wood Wide Web that exist sort of in the soil and have a symbiotic relationship with trees. That means that they depend on each other. So the fungi have these very, very tiny filaments, white or greyish threads that run through the soil, hardly visible to the naked eye, maybe a 50th of a millimetre across. And they're very good at extracting some of the extra nutrients that trees need. And they plug themselves into the roots of trees. And the trees themselves give, in return, they give the products of photosynthesis, that's kind of carbon and sugar and so on, to the fungi. So it's a sort of two-way relationship. But it turns out that it isn't just food that's going backwards and forwards. There's effectively information being sent. So when a tree is under stress, especially when there's maybe a swarm of insects or some sort of herbivores eating the tree, then signals can be sent across these, down these sort of fungal networks and can travel. Maybe it would take 20 minutes to go about 50 yards or so to other trees, that when they get that signal, they start manufacturing chemicals that defend themselves against those predators, those herbivores. So there is information being sent. Whether you can say that it's intentional or not is a whole other matter. So, there are some people who would like to believe that trees are sentient and they're sort of deciding to send messages. It's more like a message, the chemicals are diffusing and something's reacting to it, is a better way of thinking about it.
Right.
But one of the neat things, though, is that, I was brought up to think that in a forest it's absolutely dog eat dog, if you excuse the metaphor, or the fight for light. And that is going on, but also at different times of the year, different species of trees actually send via these fungal networks, they send carbon and sugar, the things that they're sort of manufacturing from photosynthesis, to trees that are a bit more needy. So at the beginning of the season, when the deciduous trees aren't yet, in leaf, but the conifers are, then they're sending carbon that way. And then at the end of the season, when the deciduous trees are really, sort of being super efficient, they can send some food the other way, which is a sort of nice altruistic thing, really.
And I'm curious, when you were writing your book, or even before you were writing it, are there science or nature writers that have inspired you, or specific books that have inspired you?
Gosh, so many. I was fortunate that we have the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew kind of research library, and I found myself, there are the sort of popular recent books, but there are some fantastic things in the archive. Especially I think the most exciting things for me were the accounts of early travellers, and just the sort of ridiculous. Hardships that they went through in the sort of 18th century looking for plants, or the 19th century, because this was a big business. People were effectively sort of wanted a monopoly on really interesting new plants that they could sell to collectors and at the sort of early garden centres and so on, and. So they clubbed together, and they sort of, groups of entrepreneurs, and they sent explorers out to go get these, amazing plants that no one had seen before, and then work out how to breed them back home. And the accounts of those people, where they were really up against time, and the investors were very keen to get a quick return. They're very funny, some of them, with appalling stories of diarrhea and leeches and all of that.
So, what books, fiction or nonfiction, have you read recently that made an impression on you and that you would recommend?
One of my favourite authors is Jim Crace. I read a book called Harvest that he wrote, and the way that he's managed to sort of conjure up a medieval village. You're never quite sure where it is, or even when it is. It's a sort of, I think one of the reviews said it's writing of hallucinatory quality, and I absolutely agreed with that. I don't think I'm nearly as good a writer as he is, but I tried in Around the World in 80 Trees to describe the trees in a way that isn't like a textbook, and he was my sort of inspiration for that. I tried to convey a kind of a feeling and an emotion along with the description. He does it fantastically well. It's absolutely luminous writing.
Great. Well, again, we've been speaking with Jonathan Drori, author of the brand new science and nature book Around the World in 80 Trees. The book is available in bookstores now, so go grab a copy. And Jonathan, thanks for doing this interview.
Thanks so much for having me.
Not since flying reindeer have the holidays seen something so amazing. Just in time to make selfie-ready holiday hair easy. Introducing the do-it-all styling tools for glam holiday hair. The holidays are happier with glam hair. And the Knot Doctor all-in-one dryer brushes from Conair makes it easy. Detangle, dry, and style in one step. No elf needed. The Knot Doctor collection has a dryer brush for every hair type and style. The pink smoothing paddle dryer brush has Flexolite bristles for painless detangling and high-performance power for quick styling and smooth, shiny results. And the purple dryer brush comes with a bonus volumizing attachment to boost lift and volume at the roots. It's perfect for salon blowouts at home. And since they're ideal for every hair type and length, they make great gifts for everyone on your list who wants beautiful hair without the hassles. Shop the Knot Doctor dryer brushes at Conair.com or at your favorite retailers now.